The Colt revolver hit the table with a sound like a coffin lid slamming shut. Emma Hurst did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching in front of dangerous men only invited more danger. She stood on the other side of the scarred oak table, her hands flat against its surface, her amber eyes fixed on the man who had just placed his weapon before her without a single word. The lantern light threw long shadows across George Bristol's face, that lean, sun-darkened face she had spent 6 weeks trying to forget, and the shadows made him look like something carved from the same red rock as the canyon walls outside her window. He said nothing. He simply stood there, hat in hand, coat dusty from 3 days of hard riding, and waited with the patience of a man who had made peace with whatever came next. Emma looked at the revolver, a Colt single-action Army, nickel-plated, with a grip worn smooth by years of use. She knew this gun the way she knew her own heartbeat. She had cleaned it once, back in the early days when she had believed in things like trust and second chances. The barrel still gleamed. He had kept it clean even when everything else between them had turned to ruin. The message was plain enough. He was surrendering. He was done with the life that had separated them, done with the blood and the dust and the dark past that had followed him like a shadow with teeth. He was placing the instrument of his survival on her table and telling her, without a single syllable, that he chose her over all of it. Emma reached across the table. Her fingers closed around the grip of the revolver. She felt its weight, its cold certainty. She thought of betrayal, and of the night she had stood in the rain outside the Tanner County jailhouse convinced he was already dead. She thought of the secrets he had kept, and the price those secrets had extracted from both of them. She thought of his voice saying her name in the dark, low and rough, like a prayer he did not quite believe he deserved to say. She slid the gun back across the table toward him. "You might need it once more," she said quietly. George Bristol stared at the revolver. Then he looked up at her. His eyes, gray as a winter sky over the plains, were not the eyes of a man who had expected this answer. "Emma, there is one more thing left undone," she said. "You know it as well as I do." The silence between them was the kind of silence that holds a whole history inside it, compressed and trembling, waiting for one of them to finally speak the truth that had been circling their lives like a hawk over carrion for the better part of 2 years. Outside, the wind moved through Caldwell, Kansas with its usual indifference, rattling the sign above the dry goods store and carrying the distant sound of the saloon piano, tinny and cheerful against the vast, uncaring dark of the frontier night. He picked up the gun. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said the only thing he could say, "When it is done, I am coming back." "I know," Emma said, and she meant it. For the first time in 2 years, she meant every word she said to George Bristol. She watched him walk out her door, and she let herself remember how they had gotten here, to this moment, to this impossible table with this impossible choice. She let herself remember the beginning, because the beginning was the only place where any of it made sense. It had been the spring of 1881 when George Bristol first rode into Caldwell, and Caldwell was a town that ate men like him for breakfast. The Kishome Trail ran right through its heart, and cattle drives brought every variety of man, imaginable honest drovers, thieves, gamblers, gunslingers for hire, and the occasional federal marshal trying to impose something resembling civilization on a landscape that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be civilized. The town sat on the southern edge of Kansas, breathing the red dust of the Indian Territory to its south, and it had a reputation built on blood and commerce in roughly equal measure. Emma Hurst had come to Caldwell 2 years before George Bristol, and she had come there by necessity rather than choice. Her father, Thomas Hurst, had operated a boarding house on Commerce Street, one of the respectable ones, with clean sheets and a strict rule against firearms at the supper table. When Thomas died of a fever in the winter of 1879, he left Emma the building, a modest debt, and the expectation that she would either sell and return to her family in Missouri or find a husband quickly enough to make the property viable. Emma had done neither. She was 24 years old, stubborn in the way that only daughters raised by widowed fathers tend to be, and she had spent 2 years building the boarding house into something Thomas Hurst would have been proud of. She served 3 meals a day, kept 7 clean rooms, and ran a small lending library in the parlor, a detail that amused most of her guests and secretly impressed the few who were literate enough to take advantage of it. She charged fair rates, extended credit when she trusted the borrower, and had a reputation for honesty that was, in Caldwell, genuinely rare. She was not soft. The frontier had a way of pressing softness out of a person the way a hot iron presses wrinkles from linen. She had navigated drunk cowboys, dishonest merchants, and at least one attempted robbery with a composure that her neighbors found either admirable or slightly unnerving, depending on the neighbor. She could shoot a rifle with reasonable accuracy, balance a ledger to the penny, and deliver an assessment of a person's character with the quiet precision of a surgeon. She trusted slowly and withdrew that trust permanently if it was abused. She was not looking for anyone when George Bristol arrived. He came in on a Tuesday in late April, when the cottonwoods along Bluff Creek were just beginning to put out their new leaves, and the air still carried the bite of the departing winter. He had ridden from the south, which was notable. Most people riding from that direction were either fleeing the territory or working for someone who needed them to be. He was alone, which was also notable. Men in his line of work rarely traveled alone if they could help it. Emma was in the yard behind the boarding house, taking down the washing, when she first saw him come around the corner of the building. He had already tied his horse at the front post and let himself through the side gate, which showed a certain comfortable familiarity with how boarding houses worked. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. He was taller than she had expected, though she could not have said what she had expected, since she had not expected anything. He wore a long dark coat over a blue shirt, and the coat was open at the front in the way men wore them when they wanted quick access to a holstered weapon. He had a hat that had seen considerable weather, and beneath the brim, his face was the face of a man in his early 30s who had spent most of those years outdoors and not all of them comfortably. "Are you the proprietress?" he asked. "I am," Emma said. She did not put down the shirt she was folding. "Emma Hurst, you want a room?" "I want the quietest room you have," he said. "I am tired." There was something in the way he said that last word that made her pause. Not the exhaustion of a man who had ridden hard for a day. Something deeper, the exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a weight that does not have a name. $3 a week, she said, meals included, no firearms at the supper table, no guests in rooms after 9 in the evening. He reached into his coat and produced a folded bill without hesitation. "A month in advance," he said, handing her 4 $12 bills. Emma took the money, counted it without embarrassment, and told him his room was the one at the end of the hall upstairs, east-facing with a view of the creek. "George Bristol," he said, and held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm but careful, the grip of a man who had learned to calibrate his own strength. "Mr. Bristol," she said. "George," he said. She showed him to his room, told him supper was at 6, and went back to her washing. She did not think about him again until supper, when he came downstairs on time, sat at the end of the table, and thanked her quietly for the meal with the same careful, measured courtesy he had shown in the yard. She noticed, over the following days, that he was not what the town assumed he was. Caldwell was a fast town for forming opinions, and the opinion it formed about George Bristol within 48 hours of his arrival was that he was a gunslinger, which was accurate, and therefore dangerous, which was only partially accurate, in the way that calling a loaded rifle dangerous ignores the question of who is holding it and why. The men at the saloon kept a respectful distance. The local marshal, a sharp-eyed man named Douglas Fitch, stopped George on the street and had a conversation that lasted 10 minutes and ended with both of them tipping their hats and going their separate ways, which Emma observed from across the street and found intriguing. What the town did not see was what Emma saw, because the town did not share a breakfast table with him. George Bristol read. He had a leather satchel that he kept in his room, and it contained 3 books, a copy of Plutarch's Lives, a dog-eared volume of Tennyson's poems, and a battered Bible that he never seemed to open for religious purposes but occasionally flipped through as if looking for something specific. He asked Emma about the lending library the second morning, and when she told him he was welcome to borrow anything he liked, he spent 20 minutes examining the shelves with the focused pleasure of a man discovering an unexpected gift. He chose a copy of Dickens's Great Expectations, which she had read twice herself, and when he returned it 4 days later, he asked her what she had made of Pip's choices in the latter half. It was, she realized later, the first real conversation they had. "I think Pip was a fool," she said without preamble, because she believed in honest opinions. He had everything that mattered and spent half the book chasing everything that did not. George considered this. "Or he was a person learning the hard way what mattered," he said. "That is not the same as being a fool. It is if the lesson costs other people," Emma said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. "Yes," he said finally, "you are right about that." She noticed he did not argue the point further, which was the response of a man who recognized a truth that landed close to home. Spring turned to summer and George Bristol did not leave. He had come to Caldwell, she eventually learned in pieces, because of a man named Warren Cole. Cole was a cattle baron who operated south of the Kansas line, in the gray legal territory between the state proper and the Indian Territory, and he had a reputation for acquiring things, land, cattle, and occasionally people, through methods that stopped well short of honest. Cole owed money to several parties who had hired George Bristol to collect it, or more precisely, to make it known that collection was expected, and that failure to comply would have consequences of a specific and physical nature. It was not a clean profession. George made no effort to pretend otherwise. When Emma asked him directly, one evening when the other boarders had retired and they were alone on the porch, what exactly his business in Caldwell was, he told her without flinching. "I am what people in this territory call a hired gun," he said. "I have been one for 8 years. I work for men who need disputes settled by means that lawyers cannot provide." "Have you killed people?" Emma asked. "Yes," he said. The porch was quiet for a moment, filled only with the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle in the pen east of town. "For money?" she asked. "For money, and sometimes for other reasons that seemed sufficient at the time." He looked out toward the dark tree line along the creek. "I am not asking you to approve of it." "Good," Emma said, "because I do not." "Then why are you still sitting here?" he asked. And the question was genuine, not a challenge, but real curiosity. Emma thought about it honestly before she answered. "Because you told me the truth," she said. "That is rarer than you might think." It was not that she had forgiven what he was before she knew what he could become. It was that Emma Hurst was a practical woman who understood that people arrived at her door carrying the lives they had lived, and the question that mattered was not where they had been, but which direction they were pointed. George Bristol, whatever he had done, was pointed in a direction she recognized, toward something cleaner and quieter than the life he had led, toward something he could not yet name but could feel the absence of the way you feel the absence of warmth. She began to care about him the way you care about a thing that is rare and fragile disguised as something hard. Slowly, carefully, without allowing herself to put words to it for a long time, because putting words to things made them real, and real things could be lost. He stayed through the summer. The business with Warren Cole was slow and complicated in the way that all dealings with powerful men are slow and complicated, because powerful men have many ways of delaying what they do not want to face. George rode south occasionally, returned dusty and tight-jawed, and said little about what had happened. Emma did not press him. She had a boarding house to run, creditors to manage, and a town that regarded her with a particular mixture of respect and condescension, reserved for women who refused to occupy the space designated for them. What she did was make his room the warmest in the house in summer, which required strategically opening the east window and closing the hallway door. A bit of domestic engineering she told herself she would have done for any long-term boarder. She made certain the coffee was hot when he came in from an early ride. She lent him every book she owned and replaced the ones he seemed most interested in from the supply wagon that came through twice a month. These were small acts, and she was aware of how they added up. He noticed. She knew he noticed because he started finding ways to be useful without being asked. The leak in the back porch roof that had been dripping for months, repaired one morning while she was at market, with no mention of it at supper. The lamp in the parlor that had been flickering due to a bent wick, corrected. The handle of the well pump, which had developed an unnerving rattle, tightened. He did these things quietly, the way he did everything, and left no invoice. The evening he asked her to walk with him along the creek was the evening things shifted into territory neither of them could pretend was purely practical. It was late August, 1881, and the heat had finally broken enough to make a late evening walk possible. The cottonwoods along Bluff Creek were heavy and green, and the light coming off the water was that particular gold that belongs exclusively to the last hour of summer afternoons. They walked without speaking for the first several minutes, which was comfortable in a way that speaking too soon would have destroyed. "I need to tell you something," George said eventually. "About Warren Cole." Emma waited. "He is not merely a man who owes money," George said. "He is also the man who killed my brother." The creek made its soft, continuous sound. Somewhere downstream, a heron lifted from the shallows and moved away against the golden sky. "Thomas," George said. "Thomas Bristol. He was a rancher just south of the line. Cole wanted his land, and when Thomas refused to sell, Cole manufactured a fraudulent promissory note, signed by a witness who has since disappeared, and when Thomas still refused, Cole sent men. 2 years ago, in the spring." Emma said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. She understood now the particular quality of his exhaustion when he had first arrived. The weight that had no name was grief, and it was also the specific, corrosive weight of an injustice that had not yet been answered. "The men who hired me know about Cole's methods," George said, "but what they want is their money. What I want," he stopped. "What you want is different," Emma said. "What I want is for him to face what he did," George said, "legally if it can be arranged. I have been trying for 6 months to find that witness, the one who signed the note. If he testifies, Cole goes to prison. And if he cannot be found," George was quiet for a moment, "then I do not know what I will do," he said. "And that frightens me more than anything else in this world, because I know what I am capable of when I am frightened." It was, she thought afterward, one of the most honest things she had ever heard a man say. Most men, in her experience, denied their capacity for darkness. George acknowledged his with the steady, uncomfortable gaze of a person trying not to look away from something important. She reached out, without quite planning to, and laid her hand briefly on his arm, just for a moment, just enough to say, "I hear you, and I am not leaving." He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. Something in his expression shifted. Something that had been very carefully held in place gave way, just a little, like a stone wall developing its first crack. "Emma," he said. "George," she said. And because they were both people who believed in the value of slowness and honesty, they left it there for that evening and walked back to the boarding house in the golden dark, and that was enough. The trouble arrived in September, the way trouble in the West always arrived fast, without announcement, and with a specificity that suggested it had been looking for you in particular. His name was Cal Riker, and he came into Caldwell on a Wednesday morning with 2 other men and went directly to the marshal's office, which was the sort of thing that could mean either official business or the performance of official business, and the distinction mattered enormously. Emma learned this from old Hal Perkins, who ran the feed store and served as Caldwell's unofficial information exchange, approximately 30 minutes after Riker's arrival. "Says he is a Pinkerton man," Hal told her, leaning on the store counter with the pleased expression of a man delivering important news. "But Marshal Fitch says his papers are not quite right. Says he is asking about a man named Bristol. Emma kept her face neutral and thanked Hal for the information, and went directly back to the boarding house. George was in the parlor reading. He looked up when she came in with the particular alertness of a man who has trained himself to read every entrance for information. "A man named Cal Riker is in town," Emma said, "claiming to be a Pinkerton agent and asking about you." George closed his book slowly. "What does he look like?" She described what Hal had told her. George's expression went carefully, still in the way that she had learned meant something had just become very serious. "Riker works for Warren Cole," he said quietly. Emma sat down across from him. "Then Cole knows you are here." "Cole has probably known for weeks," George said. "He has people everywhere. What he did not know until now is that I found a lead on the witness." He looked at her directly. "I found him, Emma. 3 weeks ago, I found the man who signed the note. He is living in Dodge City under a different name, and he is afraid, but he is also a man with a conscience that has been eating him alive for 2 years. He paused. He agreed to testify. The significance of this landed fully. "Then Cole is not trying to collect a debt," Emma said. "He is trying to stop a witness. He is trying to stop me from delivering that witness to the federal court in Wichita," George said, "which I am supposed to do in 9 days. 9 days. Emma looked at the man across from her. This careful, complicated, deeply private man who had walked into her yard in April with exhaustion in his eyes and money enough to pay a month in advance because he had not known if he would survive to the end of it, and felt something that was no longer ambiguous and had not been for some time, though she had been calling it other things to avoid the precision of the word. "What do you need?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "I need you to stay out of this," he said, "which I know is not something you are inclined toward." "I need you to let me help," she said, "which I know is not something you are comfortable with." "Emma, George." Her voice was steady. "You have spent 2 years carrying this alone. You are sitting in my parlor, which means you are not entirely alone anymore. Let me be useful." He studied her face for a long moment, and she could see the internal argument playing out behind those gray eyes, the part of him that had survived 8 years in a dangerous profession, by trusting no one, fighting against the part of him that had, over the course of one careful Kansas summer, started to trust someone very much against his better judgment. "There is a letter," he said finally, "sealed, addressed to a federal judge in Wichita. If anything happens to me before I can get the witness there, that letter needs to reach the judge. It contains the witness's written statement and the evidence I have gathered on Cole's operation. If the judge receives it, Cole cannot bury it." "Where is the letter?" He reached into his coat and placed it on the table between them. Emma looked at it without touching it. Then she looked at him. "I will keep it safe," she said. Something in his face changed. That careful, maintained composure softened at the edges, and she caught a glimpse of the man underneath the professional stillness. The man who missed his brother. The man who read Tennyson and Dickens and had fixed a leaking roof without being asked. "Thank you," he said, and the way he said it made the word mean something much larger than its 2 syllables. The next 9 days were the most frightening of Emma's life, and she had experienced several candidates for that title. Cal Riker and his 2 associates established themselves at the Caldwell Hotel and made a point of being visible, which was its own kind of threat. The demonstration that they were not hiding, that they had resources and patience, that the man they had come for already knew his options were contracting. George moved carefully and said little, but Emma could feel the tension in the air of the boarding house the way you feel weather changing, a pressure shift that made everything seem slightly more vivid and slightly more precarious. Riker came to the boarding house on the 3rd day. Emma answered the door herself. He was a compact man, neatly dressed in a gray suit that was too good for Caldwell, with pale eyes and a smile that occupied his mouth without reaching anything above it. He introduced himself politely, showed her a Pinkerton identification card that looked legitimate if you did not look too carefully, and explained that he was conducting an investigation and wanted to know if she had a boarder by the name of George Bristol. "I have several boarders," Emma said. I do not discuss their business with strangers. This is official business, Miss Hurst, Riker said pleasantly. I would not want any complications to arise for someone running a business establishment in town. Emma looked at him with the direct, unhurried gaze she had developed for precisely this kind of situation. Mr. Riker, she said, I have run this establishment for 3 years. I have dealt with drunk drovers, claim jumpers, a man who tried to pass counterfeit banknotes, and a horse thief who hid in my woodshed for 2 days. I'm not easily complicated. Good day. She closed the door. Her heart was hammering. She walked to the kitchen, put the kettle on the stove, and stood very still until her hands stopped trembling. Then she went upstairs and knocked quietly on the door at the end of the hall. Riker was just here, she said, when George opened it. He nodded slowly. I saw him through the window. He made a veiled threat about my business. George's jaw tightened. I should leave, he said. I am putting you in a position. You should stop deciding things on my behalf, Emma said, with a sharpness that surprised them both slightly. I kept the letter. I answered the door. I made the choice to be in this. You did not drag me here. He looked at her for a long moment, then very quietly, no, I did not. Then stop trying to protect me from a decision I made with full information, she said. Now, tell me exactly what the plan is for getting your witness to Wichita. He told her. It was a careful plan, built on the assumption that Riker would watch the main roads north and that the unexpected route north by northwest, through the smaller settlements, traveling during daylight on the theory that Riker would expect a night departure, was the most viable option. He had already arranged for a second horse. He intended to leave the following Tuesday, which gave him 5 days. And if Riker's men follow you? Emma asked. Then I will have to manage that, George said. George. She said his name the way she had learned to say it, with a weight to the first syllable that meant she was being completely serious. There are 3 of them and 1 of you. He met her eyes. I am aware. Marshal Fitch, she said. He is an honest man. I have seen enough dishonest ones to recognize the difference. Have you spoken to him? Fitch is sympathetic, George said, but he has no jurisdiction over what happens once I am outside town limits. He has jurisdiction over what happens inside them, Emma said. And if Riker's papers are as irregular as Hal Perkins says, that may be enough to slow him down. She paused. Let me talk to Douglas Fitch. The conversation with Marshal Fitch took place the following morning, in the small, wood-paneled office that smelled of tobacco and paper, and the particular staleness of a room where difficult decisions were made with some regularity. Emma presented herself, sat down without waiting to be invited, and explained the situation with the precision and clarity of a woman who had spent 3 years keeping accurate records. Fitch listened without interrupting. He was a careful man in his mid-40s, with the deliberate quality of someone who had seen enough impulsive decisions go wrong to have developed a profound respect for taking one's time. The Pinkerton card is irregular, he said when she finished. I noticed that myself. The agency number on it corresponds to a different office than the one Riker says he represents. He tapped his fingers on the desk. If I were to look into that more formally, it would take some time. How much time? Emma asked. I might need to detain Mr. Riker for questioning while I verified his credentials, Fitch said, with the careful neutrality of a man who knew exactly what he was offering. Legally, that could take 48 hours. Emma looked at him steadily. That would be very thorough of you, Marshal. I am a thorough man, Miss Hurst. He almost smiled. Tell Mr. Bristol I said good luck. The plan held, though barely. Fitch detained Riker and his closest associate on Friday, citing irregularities in their identification. The third man, younger, less visible, the one who had been watching the back of the boarding house rather than the front, was not detained, and it was this man, a thin fellow with red hair, who picked up George's trail when he left Tuesday morning. Emma did not know about the third man until afterward. She spent Tuesday in a state of carefully maintained normalcy, serving breakfast, repairing a tear in one of the window curtains, discussing with her neighbor Mrs. Caldwell the relative merits of 2 different flour merchants. She held the letter in the inside pocket of her apron all day, because she had promised to keep it safe, and she intended to be literal about that promise. George had been gone for 3 hours when the red-haired man came to the front door. He was not subtle. He pushed the door open without knocking and stood in the entrance hall with the posture of someone who has decided that courtesy is an obstacle. "The letter," he said. "Bristol's woman always keeps the letter." Emma stood at the foot of the stairs and looked at him with an equanimity she did not entirely feel. "I am not Bristol's woman," she said. "I am Emma Hurst, and this is my house, and you are going to leave it." He took a step forward. Emma took a step back, and in doing so she reached the hall table on which she kept a shotgun in the locked drawer. The key lived in her apron pocket beside the letter. She had the drawer open and the gun in her hands before the red-haired man fully processed what she was doing. "I will not shoot you unless I have to," she said conversationally, because honesty had always served her well. "But I will if I need to. Now, leave my house." He left. She locked the front door, went to the kitchen, put the shotgun on the table, and sat down and breathed carefully for several minutes. Then she went to the telegraph office, sent a message to Marshal Fitch's deputy about a trespasser, and went back to her house and waited. George reached Wichita on Thursday. The witness testified on Friday. The federal judge issued an arrest warrant for Warren Cole on Saturday, which was, as Emma would learn later, also the day that Cole's attorneys began the process of dismantling everything their employer had spent 20 years building, because several of Cole's associates, understanding the direction things were going, began providing their own statements with considerable enthusiasm. Emma learned all of this when George returned. He came back on a Sunday evening, when the light was again that particular gold she associated with him, because the best of her memories of that summer were built in that light. He came around the corner of the house the same way he had the first time, through the side gate, and she was not doing laundry on this occasion. She was sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee and the letter, which she had not been able to bring herself to put away. She heard the gate and looked up, and there he was. He had ridden hard, and it showed dusty coat, lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the particular tightness of a man who has been managing something difficult for a sustained period, and is only now allowing himself to stop managing it. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at her, and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because the silence contained everything that needed to be said, and putting it into words felt almost beside the point. "It is done," he said. "I know," she said. "Come sit down." He came up the steps and sat in the other chair, and she poured him coffee from the pot she had kept warm without quite admitting to herself why she had kept it warm. He took the cup and held it and did not drink immediately, just held the warmth of it. "The witness is safe," he said. "Cole will stand trial. The ranch land that was taken from Thomas's estate, there is a legal process to return it now. His wife and children," he stopped for a moment. "My sister-in-law and her children. They may get it back." Emma felt the full weight of what that meant. 2 years. A brother lost, a fraudulent debt, a family turned out of their home, and this man carrying the whole of it alone from one end of the territory to the other, until he found the one thread that would unravel the whole injustice. She thought about what that kind of sustained purpose cost a person. "George," she said. He looked at her. "I have been wanting to say something to you for several months," she said, "and I have been finding reasons not to say it, mostly because saying things makes them permanent, and permanent things can be broken." He waited. He was very good at waiting. "I love you," she said. "I do not mean that lightly, and I do not say it without intending to mean it tomorrow and every day after. I understand who you are and where you have been, and I am not asking you to be a different person. I am asking you whether the life you want to build now has room in it for someone who will argue with you about Dickens and keep your letter safe and refuse to flinch when dangerous men come to the door." The silence that followed was brief, but it was the kind of brief silence that contains a very large answer working its way to the surface. George Bristol set down his coffee cup. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand in both of his. the way a person handles something they are afraid of damaging through insufficient care. "Emma," he said, "I have loved you since the morning you shook my hand in the yard and counted my money without embarrassment, because it was the first honest thing that had happened to me in so long I had nearly forgotten what it felt like." She laughed a real laugh, sudden and genuine because of all the moments he could have named. That was such a specific and such a thoroughly George Bristol thing to name. "I want to stay," he said, "if you will have me, not as a boarder." "Definitely not as a boarder," Emma said. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles with a formality that was also, somehow, completely sincere. She felt the warmth of it move all the way to her center. "Then I am staying," he said. The autumn of 1881 was the best Emma Hurst had ever experienced. George Bristol, it turned out, was a man who had been waiting for permission to be at peace, and once that permission was granted, he took to it with the same focused dedication he had brought to every other thing in his life. He was useful in the way that practical people are useful, quietly, specifically, without making a production of it. He fixed the fence along the east side of the property, repainted the front of the boarding house the blue-gray color Emma had wanted for 2 years and not gotten around to, and spent a memorable October morning on the roof replacing a section of shingles that had been a source of ongoing anxiety since August. He was also, she discovered, a man who laughed more than she had expected. The professional stillness that he wore in public was something he put down in private the way you put down a heavy tool at the end of a working day, with relief, with deliberate placement, with no apparent desire to pick it up again until it was necessary. He laughed at her opinions on literature, which were frequently stronger than the text strictly required. He laughed at his own stories, told in the evenings when the other boarders had gone to bed, of the various misadventures that 8 years of a dangerous profession had accumulated. He had a talent for making the frightening things in his past sound, in retrospect, almost farcical, which she understood was partly a coping mechanism and partly a genuine gift for narrative perspective. They were careful with each other in those early months. Not cautious in the way of people who are afraid of each other, but careful in the way of people who understand that something good can be damaged by moving faster than its foundations can support. He kissed her for the first time on an evening in October on the front porch, when a cold wind had come out of the north and the stars were very bright and close, and the kiss was exactly what she had expected it to be, deliberate, warm, and unhurried, the kiss of a man who was not trying to take anything but to offer something. She kissed him back in a way that made his breath catch, which she found deeply satisfying. "Well," he said. "Indeed," she said. He proposed to her in December, just before Christmas, with a quiet directness that suited both of them. There were no elaborate preparations, no performance. He simply waited until they were alone in the parlor after supper and said, "I want to marry you, Emma, if you will say yes." "Yes," she said, and then, "I already knew you were going to ask. You have been rehearsing that sentence for 3 weeks." He stared at her. "How did you know?" "Because you looked at me differently every time you almost said it, and then decided not to," she said. "You have a very expressive face for a man who thinks he is inscrutable." He laughed that real laugh from the chest that she had first heard in September and had since regarded as one of her favorite sounds in the world. "God help me," he said. "I am going to marry the one woman in Kansas who can read my mind." "Someone has to," Emma said. They were married in February of 1882 in the Caldwell church by a Methodist minister who had performed enough frontier weddings to do so with efficient warmth. Emma wore her good dress, brown wool with ivory buttons, which was not a wedding dress but was the finest thing she owned and looked well on her. George wore a new jacket, dark blue, well cut, purchased with the last of the advance money from his former employers, whom he had formally and finally resigned from on the same day he fixed the fence. Marshall Fitch attended. Several of the regular boarders attended. Mrs. Caldwell attended and cried, which she would deny afterward. Old Hal Perkins attended and said afterward at the feed store that it was about time, which everyone in town agreed with. George's sister-in-law, Clara Bristol, came up from the territory with her 2 children, a boy of 8 named Robert and a girl of 5 named Mary. They had been living with Clara's parents since Thomas's death, and the legal process of recovering the ranch land was proceeding, but slowly, because the law moved at its own pace regardless of the urgency of the people it was meant to serve. It was the first time Emma had met Clara, and she understood immediately why George had fought so hard and so long. Clara was a woman of quiet, sustained courage who had maintained her dignity through 2 years of loss with a composure that Emma recognized as kin to her own. After the ceremony, when the children were running around the churchyard burning off their formal dress energy, and Clara was talking with Mrs. Fitch, Emma stood beside George and watched them. "They will get the land back," George said. It was half certainty and half prayer. "They will," Emma said and took his hand. The boarding house continued to operate through the spring and summer of 1882, though the nature of it shifted somewhat. George was now not only a resident but an active partner in the enterprise. Not because Emma needed him to be, but because he had found, to his own surprise, that he genuinely enjoyed the work of maintaining a place where people could feel safe and comfortable. He had a talent with difficult guests that she had not expected, a calm authority that diffused situations before they became confrontations, and an ability to fix things that were broken that went beyond mere usefulness into something that seemed to give him genuine satisfaction. It was, Emma thought, because the work was constructive rather than destructive. He had spent 8 years in a profession built entirely on the threat of destruction, and the discovery that his skills and energy could be applied to building things, shelves, fences, peace, in a busy common room, seemed to be answering something in him that had been hungry for a long time. The news from Warren Cole's trial came in June. Cole was convicted on fraud, land theft, and conspiracy charges. The murder of Thomas Bristol could not be directly proven beyond the reasonable legal standard, but the fraud conviction carried sufficient weight that Cole would serve 15 years in the federal penitentiary. His assets were seized, and the land that had been fraudulently taken from Thomas Bristol's estate was ordered returned to Clara and her children. George received the telegram at the Caldwell post office on a Tuesday morning. Emma was behind the boarding house pruning the kitchen garden when he came around the corner, and she knew from the way he walked, a looseness in his step that she had never quite seen before, that the news was good. He handed her the telegram. She read it. Then she looked up at him, and the look on his face undid her completely, because it was the face of a man whose debt to the past had finally been paid, and who was standing, perhaps for the first time in many years, entirely in the present. She put her arms around him, right there in the kitchen garden with the tomato plants and the onions, and held him, and he held her back with a thoroughness that said more than any sentence could. "It is over," he said against her hair. "The right part is just beginning," she said. He pulled back enough to look at her face. "Are you going to say something wise and declarative every time I reach a significant moment?" "Almost certainly," Emma said. "Good," he said, and kissed her in the kitchen garden with the same warmth and deliberateness that had characterized every kiss he had given her since October, and she kissed him back with the same complete sincerity. And above them the Kansas sky was blue and enormous and entirely indifferent to the smallness of the moment, which made the moment feel, paradoxically, enormous. Clara and the children moved back to the Bristol ranch land that summer. George rode down with a group of men from Caldwell who owed him various forms of goodwill, and they spent a week repairing what Cole's tenants had damaged and neglecting to maintain over 2 years. Emma sent supplies: flour, sugar, salt, tinned goods, seed, and received a letter from Clara a month later that said simply, "It looks like Thomas's place again. Thank you, both of you." Emma kept the letter in the desk drawer beside the one from the federal judge acknowledging receipt of evidence, and beside the marriage certificate, and beside the small collection of things she was accumulating that constituted the documentary evidence of a life that was going in the right direction. In August, she told George she was expecting a child. They were in the parlor, evening again, the soft lamplight that had become the light of their most important conversations. Emma told him directly, as she told him everything, watching his face for the response. He sat very still for a moment. Then a slow smile moved across his face, unhurried, genuine, the smile of a man discovering something he had not quite known he wanted until it was suddenly real. "When?" he asked. "March, I think," she said. He reached over and covered her hand with his. They sat like that for several minutes, not speaking, in the comfortable way of people who have learned that silence shared is its own form of communication. "I am going to be a good father," he said. It was not a boast. It was a quiet, serious statement of intention, the kind he made about things that mattered. "I know," Emma said. "You are already a good man. The father part follows from that." He looked at her with an expression that she had no adequate word for, except perhaps grateful. Not grateful the way a person is grateful for a favor. Grateful the way a person is grateful to have arrived somewhere they had been traveling toward without knowing the destination. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was a Caldwell winter, cold, sustained, and demanding, but the boarding house was warm. The business was good, and Emma found that pregnancy sat well with her in terms of health, if not in terms of comfort during the later months. George was, as she had expected, practical and attentive in equal measure. He did not hover or fuss, which would have driven her to distraction, but he was present in all the ways that mattered, which was precisely what she needed. Robert Bristol, named for both George's grandfather and in honor of his brother Thomas's middle name, was born on a March morning in 1883, in the bedroom above the boarding house kitchen, delivered by the town's physician with a competence that Emma was very grateful for. He was a healthy, loud, emphatic boy, who made his opinion of the world clearly known from his first minute in it. George held him with the careful deliberateness he brought to every fragile thing, and the look on his face was the most unguarded Emma had ever seen, not the professional stillness, not the careful composure, but something entirely open, entirely present. "Robert," he said softly. The baby opened his eyes and regarded his father with the stern, unfocused gaze of the newly arrived. He looked skeptical, Emma observed from the bed, exhausted and satisfied. "He looks like you," George said. "The expression is exactly yours when you are evaluating something." This made her laugh, which hurt slightly, and was entirely worth it. Robert's arrival changed the texture of their days in ways that were both exactly what they expected, and not at all what they expected, which is the nature of all significant changes. The boarding house adapted around him, a cradle in the kitchen during the day, a bedroom arrangement reorganized to accommodate the unpredictable rhythms of an infant, a general understanding among the regular boarders that the small person who sometimes punctuated the evening meal with urgent commentary was a permanent feature of the establishment and was not to be argued with. George took to fatherhood the way he took to everything, fully, with focused attention, without complaint. He learned Robert's sleep patterns and fed him when Emma needed rest. He walked the length of the back porch innumerable times on cold nights when the baby would not settle for reasons that remained mysterious, with the patient endurance of a man who had once waited 6 months for a witness to agree to testify, and therefore understood that some things required simply continuing to show up. Caldwell in 1883 was still a cattle town, still rough at the edges, still producing its regular quota of drama and incident. But it was also a town in the process of becoming something more settled, more permanent, new buildings going up along Commerce Street, a second church, a school that George had contributed both money and labor to building, because he had opinions about Robert's future education that started early and were not going to be deterred by the fact that Robert was currently several years away from needing a classroom. Emma ran the boarding house through all of it, adjusting and expanding as the town grew. She added 2 rooms in 1883, using savings accumulated carefully over 3 years. She started a small account at the Caldwell Bank that she did not discuss with anyone except George, because financial independence was something she believed in as a principle, not as a criticism of her marriage. George agreed with her entirely, because he was a man who understood that a person's sense of their own solidity was not diminished by depending on someone. It was, in fact, the opposite. You had to know where you stood before you could lean. The question of George's past arose once more, in the spring of 1883, in a form neither of them had anticipated. A man named James Alcott rode into Caldwell looking for George, which was itself unremarkable. Various people from George's former professional life turned up occasionally, usually wanting to offer work that George politely and firmly declined. But Alcott was different. He was not looking to hire. He was the brother of a man named Davis Alcott, who had died in a confrontation with George 4 years earlier in Abilene, and he had spent those 4 years building toward a conversation that he clearly intended to end in a specific way. George learned of his presence the same way he had learned of Riker's from Emma, who had a better intelligence network than most law enforcement offices because she ran the place where everyone in town eventually stopped for a meal. They talked about it that evening when Robert was asleep and the house was quiet. "Alcott's brother drew on me first," George said. "I can document that. There were witnesses. This is not," he stopped. "It is not a hidden truth," Emma said. "I know. But it is a consequence," George said. "A man died because of what I was, and his brother has been carrying that for 4 years, and it does not matter that it was justified by the legal standards of the moment. The fact of it is the fact of it." Emma looked at her husband, the man who read Plutarch and fixed leaking roofs and walked their son to sleep on cold nights and had just, without being asked, articulated the moral complexity of his own situation with a precision that most men would have spent a lifetime avoiding. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to talk to him," George said, "directly, without weapons. I want to tell him what happened and why, and I want to acknowledge what it cost him, and I want to let him say whatever he needs to say." Emma considered this. "That is dangerous." "Yes," George said, "but it is honest." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I will be in the building." The meeting took place the next morning, in the parlor of the boarding house, with the windows open to the street and Emma in the adjoining kitchen within clear earshot. Alcott was a young man, younger than George had expected, mid-20s, weathered in the way of someone who had been driving himself hard without adequate rest, with the red-eyed, slightly unfocused look of a man who had been carrying something heavy long enough that he had stopped feeling its weight as a separate thing, and now simply felt it as the condition of existence. George told him the truth about that night in Abilene, clear, complete, without minimizing or dramatizing. Davis Alcott had come looking for a fight over a card game debt that had gone wrong, and he had drawn first, and the outcome had been determined by the specific physics of that moment. George told James Alcott that he understood why that explanation was insufficient. He told him that he was sorry, not for surviving, but for the fact that the situation had happened at all, and for the loss of a brother that no legal justification could undo. James Alcott sat in the parlor chair for a long time after George finished speaking. Then he said, "My brother was not a good man. His voice was raw. I know that. I have always known that, but he was my brother." "I know," George said. Another silence. From the kitchen, Emma could hear the quality of it, not hostile, not resolved, but something shifting. "I came here thinking I wanted something from you," Alcott said finally. "I am not sure anymore what it was." "Sometimes coming and saying the thing out loud is the whole of it," George said. Alcott looked at him. Then he looked around the parlor at the bookshelves, at the small framed sketch of the creek that Emma had put up last autumn, at the cradle visible through the doorway where Robert was napping. He seemed to be recalibrating. "You have a life here," he said. "I do," George said. Alcott nodded slowly. He stood up. He looked at George for another moment, and the look was complicated, and it was not resolved, but it was honest, and honest was the most that could be asked of such a moment. "I do not forgive you," Alcott said. "I am not sure I know how to, but I am not going to." He stopped. "I just needed you to know it cost something, what you were, not you personally. The whole." He gestured vaguely. "I know," George said. "I think about it." Alcott left. George stayed in the parlor chair for several minutes after, and Emma came in from the kitchen and sat across from him without saying anything, because some moments did not need words added to them. She put her hand on his, and he turned it over and held it, and they sat in the quiet parlor while Robert slept in the next room and the Kansas spring moved through the open window, warm and purposeful. "Well," George said finally. "Well," Emma agreed. "That was the last of it, I think," he said. "The last thing from before." Emma thought about that. The last thread of the before: Cole in prison, Thomas's land restored, the witness safe, and now this, the rower and more personal accounting. Not resolved because some things did not fully resolve, but acknowledged, spoken, placed in the proper light. "Then the after gets to be just ours," she said. He looked at her with such particular warmth that she felt it like something physical, like the sun coming out from behind cloud. "Yes," he said, "just ours." The years that followed were not simple. Frontier life in Caldwell in the 1880s was not a simple proposition for anyone, but they were good, in the way that a life built on honest foundations is good, with the specific satisfaction of something genuinely earned. George took a formal partnership in the boarding house in 1884, which required a legal document that Emma insisted on having drafted properly, because she was still Emma Hurst where financial arrangements were concerned, regardless of whose name now came after hers. The partnership suited both of them. He managed the physical operations with his characteristic competence. She managed the finances and the guest relationships with her characteristic precision. They disagreed on occasion with the productive honesty of two people who respect each other enough not to pretend. Robert grew into a boy of extraordinary stubbornness and curiosity, which everyone who knew his parents found completely unsurprising. He learned to read at 4, which Emma took as personal satisfaction, and George took as confirmation of a theory he had been developing since Robert's second month of life. He asked questions in the penetrating, relentless manner of a child who has been raised in a household where questions were consistently taken seriously and answered honestly, which means he asked them constantly and waited for real answers. Emma was expecting their second child in the spring of 1886, and the pregnancy was, if anything, easier than Robert's had been, which she said nothing about aloud, because she understood enough about such things to know that announcing ease was an invitation to complication. The second child arrived in April, a girl, born on a morning so extravagantly bright and spring-warm that it seemed slightly excessive. They named her Catherine, for George's mother, and she was from the first moment a person of strong opinions and sunny temperament, which George said was exactly like Emma and Emma said was entirely like George, and both of them were slightly right. Clara Bristol wrote from the ranch that spring to say that the land was fully recovered, the cattle herd rebuilt, and that she was considering remarriage. A rancher from 3 counties east who had been courting her with patient respect for 2 years. She asked George's opinion, which he gave with characteristic honesty, that she should marry anyone who made her laugh, which Thomas had done reliably, and which, based on Clara's letter, this man seemed capable of as well. Clara married him in June, and George attended, and stood beside his brother's grave at the small cemetery on the ranch property, and stood there quietly for a while, and then came home to Emma and Robert and the infant Catherine, and did not speak of Thomas directly, but was perhaps slightly quieter than usual for a day or two. Emma did not press him. She simply was there, the way she had always been present, steady, honest, the specific kind of love that asks nothing in return because it is not a transaction. Caldwell grew and changed and grew some more through the late 1880s as Kansas settled, and the wild edge of the frontier moved further south and west, and the cattle drives eventually dwindled as the railroads changed everything about how beef moved from the range to the market. The boarding house evolved with the town, less useful for drovers, more useful for the merchants and professionals and settlers who arrived in the wake of the cattle era's passing. George occasionally consulted for Marshall Fitch on matters that required someone who understood the particular psychology of men from the violent end of the professional spectrum, which was a way of using his past that sat better with both of them than simply burying it. By 1889, when Kansas was solidifying as a state with real institutional bones, Emma and George had been married for 7 years, and the life they had built had the particular depth of something constructed day by day over a long period rather than assembled quickly. Robert was 6 and heading toward the kind of childhood that required constant monitoring and contained considerable joy. Catherine was 3 and had recently discovered that she could reach the kitchen table if she stood on her toes, a development that had implications for the preservation of pies. On an evening in October again, that month that seemed to belong to them particularly, Emma and George sat on the back porch after the children were in bed, with coffee and the cold stars and the sound of the creek down below the property, which had become over 8 years the most familiar sound in Emma's world. "I want to tell you something," George said. Emma waited. She was still very good at waiting for the right things. "I have been thinking about Thomas's ranch," he said. "Clara and her husband are doing well. They do not need," he paused. "But there is the northern section, the 40 acres above the creek that was never developed. It is still technically part of the estate." He looked at her. "I have been wondering whether we might want to build there." Emma considered this carefully. The boarding house had been her life for 9 years, since before George, since before everything. It was hers in the most fundamental sense, the thing she had built alone, the proof of what she was capable of. "Leave the boarding house," she said. "Not abandon it," George said. "Sell it perhaps to someone who would run it well, or keep it and hire a manager." He paused. "It has been a good life here, Emma. I'm not criticizing it. But I find myself thinking about a place that is wholly ours, not a business, not a public house. A home. Room for Robert and Catherine," and he stopped. "And," Emma said, he met her eyes. "I thought perhaps Robert and Catherine might benefit from a sibling," he said, with the careful understatement of a man who has learned to frame large ideas in small packages when speaking to a woman who will evaluate them on their merits. Emma looked at him for a long moment. The creek made its sound below them. The stars were the same stars that had been over Caldwell since before anyone had put a name on the town. "You want a ranch," she said. "I want a home," he said. "With you and our children, a place with room to grow things. The ranch is one possibility." Emma thought about Clara's letter, about the north section above the creek, about the image of a house set back from the water with room for a kitchen garden and a fence, and perhaps some cattle and definitely some horses, because Robert had been asking about horses with increasing specificity for the past year. She thought about the boarding house, which had been her foundation and her proof and her anchor for 9 years, and whether she was still the person who needed those things in that particular form, or whether she had, without noticing the moment of it, become solid enough in herself to set them down. She thought about George's face in the kitchen garden when the telegram came, the looseness in his step, the sentence he had said, "It is over." She thought about Robert and Catherine asleep inside, and about the hypothetical third person who was apparently a matter of current consideration, and about the north section above the creek, and about the fact that George Bristol had walked into her yard 8 years ago with exhaustion in his eyes and had, over the course of all the time since, become the person without whom the best version of her life was not fully imaginable. "We should go see it," she said. "The north section, before we decide anything." "Yes," he said, "and if it is what you are imagining," she looked at him steadily, "then we go home." The word sat between them in the October air, carrying its full weight, which was considerable. Home. Not a building you operate for guests. not a place you came to out of necessity and stayed in out of stubbornness. A place you choose deliberately with full information, because it is where the people who matter most to you are. George reached over and took her hand. His thumb moved across her knuckles, the same gesture he had made 8 years ago on the back porch when she had put her hand on his arm by the creek. She felt it the same way she had felt it then, as something precise and intentional, the gesture of a man who never touched anything carelessly. "Emma," he said. "George," she said. They sat like that for a long time, in the particular peace of people who have earned their quiet together, while the stars moved overhead in their slow indifference, and the creek kept its perpetual conversation with the dark, and the children slept, and the October night wrapped itself around the back porch of the Hurst Bristol boarding house, and everything that had brought them to this moment. The gun on the table, the letter in the apron pocket, the kitchen garden and the Dickens and the telegram and the wedding in February, and the boy named Robert and the girl named Catherine, and all the small, daily choosing of each other, settled into its proper shape at last. In the spring of 1890, they sold the boarding house to a young couple from Ohio who had exactly the right kind of practical energy and the willingness to learn what Emma spent 3 weeks teaching them. Emma negotiated the sale price herself, which resulted in a number she found satisfactory, and the young couple from Ohio found instructive in the nature of dealing with a woman who understood her assets. They moved to the north section of the Bristol Ranch land in April, when the creek was running high with the snowmelt from the hills, and the cottonwoods were beginning their annual declaration of spring. George had spent the preceding autumn and winter, with help from Clara's husband and a crew of men from Caldwell, building the house, a solid, practical structure, 2 stories, with good windows and a wraparound porch and a kitchen large enough to actually function in, which had been Emma's primary specification. She had contributed 3 detailed lists of requirements over the course of construction, which George had followed with only 2 instances of architectural disagreement, both of which they had resolved through the method they had developed for all disagreements, which was direct conversation followed by a decision made jointly and not revisited. The day they arrived with the wagon and the children and the accumulated material of their life in Caldwell, George drove the wagon to the front of the house and stopped and looked at Emma. "Well," he said. Emma looked at the house, at the porch, which was exactly right, at the kitchen garden space beside the south wall, which she had already planned out in her head over the winter, at the creek visible below the property's edge, bright in the April light, the same creek that had run past the boarding house for all those years, just a different stretch of it. At Robert, who was nearly 7 and vibrating with the contained excitement of a child, who has just been informed that there are horses in the barn, and at Catherine, who was 4 and was methodically assessing the porch steps with the thoroughness she brought to all new environments. She looked at George. He was watching her with the particular attention he had always given her, that focused, honest regard that had felt, from the very first morning, like being genuinely seen. "It is exactly right," she said. He exhaled slowly, and she realized he had been holding something in for months. The question of whether he had built the right thing in the right place, whether he had understood correctly what she wanted, whether the life he was proposing was the life she would choose if she were choosing freely. The answer in her voice apparently settled it, because the exhale was the exhale of a person setting something down that they have been carrying with great care for a long time. He helped her down from the wagon. She took his hand and stepped onto the grass in front of the house they were going to live in, that he had built, that was theirs, and stood for a moment with the April wind in her hair and the creek below and the enormous Kansas sky overhead. Robert was already running toward the barn. Catherine had successfully negotiated the porch steps and was examining the front door with professional interest. "Come on," Emma said, and pulled George toward the porch. The 3rd baby arrived in November of 1890, a girl they named Alice, and she was from the first moment a person of quiet determination and very particular preferences, which Robert found baffling and Catherine found entirely reasonable. Alice slept when she wanted to sleep and was loudly specific about her schedule for everything else, and she had George's gray eyes and Emma's exact expression when considering a problem, which everyone who visited the ranch found both charming and slightly alarming, because one Emma Bristol level of assessment per room was already considerable. George sat one evening in December, with Alice asleep on his chest, and the fire going and Robert and Catherine long since in bed, and Emma reading beside the lamp, and the sound of the winter wind outside the house that was now completely and thoroughly home. He looked at his wife, her dark hair lit from the side by the lamp, her eyes moving across the page with that particular focused attention she gave to things she found interesting. She looked up and found him watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" He looked at Alice, asleep against his shoulder with the complete trust of the very young, and then back at Emma. "About how many things had to go exactly the right way for this to exist," he said. "This, right now. You and the children and this house," and he paused, and the pause was the particular pause of George Bristol at his most honest, when something large was working its way to the surface and he was letting it rather than managing it. "I rode into Caldwell 9 years ago exhausted down to the bone, and I was not expecting anything except the resolution of a business matter. And instead you got stuck with me," Emma said. "Instead," he said, "I got the whole world." Emma looked at him for a moment, this man who had walked into her yard and paid a month in advance and fixed her roof, and told her the truth about what he was, and proposed in the parlor, and built her a house above the creek, and held every small and large and fragile thing she had ever given him with the same deliberate, unfailing care. She set down her book. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the settle, careful not to disturb Alice, and leaned her head against his shoulder, and felt his arm come around her without either of them needing to think about it, because that was what they had built, the kind of certainty that did not need to announce itself. "George," she said softly. He said. "The whole world goes both ways," she said. He pressed his mouth to the top of her head. Outside, the Kansas winter moved through the dark, indifferent and immense. Inside the house above the creek, the fire was warm and the children were sleeping, and the life they had built together lay around them in all its specific, chosen, irreplaceable detail. The Colt revolver was in a box in the bedroom closet, where it had been since the day George had brought it home, after the last use he had put it to, the last act of the old life, the clearing of a final debt to the past. Emma had put it there herself, because it was a part of his history and therefore a part of the history of their life, and she did not believe in erasing history. But she also did not believe in keeping it in immediate reach, because they were not people who needed it in immediate reach anymore. She had slid it back across the table to him once because she had known there was one more thing to be done, one more thread to pull before the pattern was complete. And he had done it, and he had come back. Exactly as he had promised. And she had known when she said those words that he would. Because she had always known George Bristol, from the first morning in the yard to the last evening on the porch to every morning and evening since. She had known the truth of him underneath the professional stillness, the person he was becoming underneath the person he had been. She had chosen to see it before he could fully see it himself, which was, she thought, perhaps the most useful thing she had ever done. And George Bristol, for his part, had walked into a boarding house in Caldwell, Kansas, looking for a quiet room, and instead found the most complete and particular love of his life sitting in the yard taking down washing with the calm, direct gaze of someone who was going to see through everything he had ever used to keep people at a distance. He had not been ready for her. No amount of experience with the dangerous and unpredictable prepared a person for Emma Hurst. But he had been ready enough to stay, and staying for them had been everything. The spring of 1891 brought new calves, and a late frost, and the news from Clara that her own youngest had been born, a boy, which Clara wrote was a relief because she had begun to wonder if the Bristol family had some predisposition toward daughters, which was not a problem but did make certain arrangements more complicated. George wrote back that he was delighted by the news and that daughters were excellent and she should not complain. Clara wrote back that she was not complaining, she was observing, and that he sounded very much like a man surrounded by daughters, which was its own education. Robert turned 8 that spring, and had developed a fluency with horses that his father watched with the quiet, satisfied attention of someone witnessing an aptitude genuinely suited to the life being lived. Catherine was 5, and had begun asking Emma to teach her to read, which Emma commenced immediately, with the same focused dedication she had brought to every significant undertaking. Alice was 6 months old, and had the personality of someone who had arrived with clear existing opinions, and intended to pursue them. One morning in May, Emma stood on the wraparound porch with her coffee and watched Robert in the corral with his father, learning the particular conversation between a horse and a rider, all the small communications that had to be learned rather than assumed. George was patient and specific in his instruction, the way he was patient and specific about everything that mattered, and Robert was listening with the complete attention of a child who has found the thing that makes perfect sense to him. Catherine came out of the house and stood beside Emma. "Mama," she said. "Yes," Emma said. "Is Papa teaching Robert to be a cowboy?" Emma considered this. "Papa is teaching Robert to work with horses," she said. "What he does with that knowledge is up to him." Catherine thought about this with the gravity she brought to philosophical questions. "Can you teach me?" she asked. "You can ask Papa to teach you," Emma said. "He will say yes." Catherine nodded, satisfied, and went back inside to pursue some other project. Emma stood on the porch with her coffee in the May morning and watched her husband and her son in the corral below, moving in the patient rhythm of a lesson that would take years to complete and would be worth every day of it. George looked up at some point and found her watching. He lifted his chin in the small acknowledgement that was theirs, the specific gesture that meant, "I see you, I am here, everything is as it should be." Emma lifted her coffee cup in response. Everything was indeed as it should be. The boarding house in Caldwell was someone else's life now, and this, the ranch above the creek, the 3 children and the horses and the kitchen garden and the fire in December, and the porch in May and the man in the corral below who had ridden into her yard with exhaustion in his eyes and paid a month in advance, and against all probability and through the sustained practice of choosing honestly, this was home. The gun stayed in the closet. It would stay there, she thought, for the rest of their lives. And that was exactly right.